So good afternoon, everyone. So thank you for that introduction as well, Rob. Unfortunately, as you might notice, I am not Joel Markham, who is not here with us today. He is off doing much more exciting things, if you could possibly imagine that, than talking about Dataflow, whatever next. So I stepped in to come and talk to you guys. So as Rob has introduced me, I am the head of PPM delivery within iCoTech. So my role is really everything PPM within the organisation. So helping our customers develop their PPM potential. It's working with some of the new products coming through and some of the consultancy around PPM as well. So what we're going to do today, we're going to talk about Dataflows. That's why you're all here. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what Dataflows are. I'm going to tell you where they can kind of fit within the wider Power Platform, why we can use them, and then probably the most exciting bit. I'm going to give you a demo, so I'm actually going to go onto Power Apps and I'm going to create one from scratch and just walk you through the process. Now, I appreciate I don't really know the audience, so I don't know if you guys are technical or non-technical. So I do apologise. I'm going to go from a completely non-technical standpoint and just assume you know nothing. So please don't be insulted. But that does mean I won't try to use any jargon or anything like that. Rob, if you're controlling the screen, do you want to go to the next slide? So the first question then really is kind of, what are data flows? What we know is the volume of data in the world is growing. We know we've got systems that are proliferating all over the place, and we know that we need to bring that data together so it's more well informed, so it's more actionable. We can do more things with it through our reports and through our applications. So if you simply Googled what is a data flow, you'd probably get something back like, data flows are a self-service cloud-based data preparation technology. I mean, that's straight out of the Microsoft website. Okay, that's great, but what does that actually mean? Okay, so let's say what it isn't. Data flows, they are not a data warehouse. Okay, I'm going to contradict myself in a minute because later on I'm going to tell you they kind of can be used as a data warehouse as well. But fundamentally, the intention of data flows is not to have a big set of data there that you can utilize in the background at some stage. Data flows, they're not Power Automate. So Power Automate is a workflow tool, and although that can move data around in the background, that is not designed to move large volumes of data from different data sources. It's very much a tool for use within the Power Platform itself. And it isn't Azure Data Factory either. Azure Data Factory is really designed for kind of big, raw, unorganized data sets that don't really have any kind of relationships and need to have something structured together. Data flows are really built much more around structured data, and in that sense are a ETL tool. So I said I wouldn't talk about jargon, and I already have. So ETL, what do I mean by that? That simply stands for extract, transform, and load. So what that means is the tool can connect to a data source somewhere. It can connect to that data. It can pull that data in centrally. It can then run some transformations on that data. So it can make some changes to that data. Maybe it wants to filter the data, cut down the number of fields, whatever it might be. And then the L for load. So it can take that data that it's transformed and it can push it somewhere else where that system or the receiving area can then do something with that. So a data flow in a number of senses is essentially a container for entities. Again, I've gone into jargon, but what's an entity? An entity is essentially a table of data, or it's something that relates to something within your organization that is structured data. So maybe that's related to a person or a project or an account or a customer, whatever it might be. Once you set up a workflow, they can run on demand or automatically. So it's really a case of creating how regularly you need to have a refresh of that data. You can keep it as up to date as you want. So you can have an incremental refresh of that if you need to. And data flows have really been around for some time. I say some time, but it's at least 2 years. That's some time in Microsoft language. They started within the Power BI platform, but they've really evolved to then the rest of the platform as well. So trying to describe what data flows are and what they do, but I do find kind of a picture describes that much better than anything else. So if we move on to the next slide, this simply kind of describes, how a data flow can connect to various different structured data sources, wherever they may be. It can then do that transformation. So this is the T in the ETL. And then it takes that data and that makes that data available elsewhere. So for data flows, they connect to any data. The transformation is done through a tool called Power Query. And when we come on to have a look at that, some of you guys might actually recognize Power Query. And then the data can actually be stored in essentially two places. So in something called Dataverse, which is what Power Apps use to access its data, or in the Azure Data Lake. And I'm not going to talk about really, although I will mention Azure Data Lakes, I'm not going to talk about that in any real detail today. So we move on to the next slide. That kind of describes how this infrastructure essentially works. It's all cloud-based because it's Microsoft is sitting on the 365 platform. So essentially, the majority of the data it's accessing comes from different cloud sources. Okay, so whether that's SaaS services or other data within Azure, data within SharePoint Online, wherever that might be. But there is a capability to connect to on-prem data sources as well. So if you've got a SQL Server, for example, where you're storing some finance data or something like that, there's a big box in the corner of your office. There is the ability to link in that data. It's not as simple as linking to a SaaS service or to data in the cloud. You need to build a gateway that will essentially synchronize that data up to the cloud. But the point is you can bring in some of that more local data as well. If we move on to the next slide, this essentially describes the kind of load element. So once we've gone through the transformation, we can put that data into Dataverse or into Azure Data Lake. And then there are various components within the Power Platform that can actually pick up that data and start to consume it. So they can do things with it. The two key ones probably are Power BI and Power Apps. So from a reporting perspective, you can take that data and create visualizations and charts and whatever else you want to on the back of that. Power Apps, you can embed the data within your actual application, so enriching it with some more information in there as well. And that's really the one we're going to focus on today. But the other components of the Power Platform are there as well. So Power Automate to do some workflow work on that. Dynamics 365, which is obviously the big brother for the Power Platform, and the virtual agents as well, which are looking at AI and chatbots and other exciting things like that as well. So how does this really relate back to Power Apps and what can we do? The key thing here is the integration of data via Dataflow into what's called Dataverse. So Dataverse was what was previously referred to as the common data service, but essentially this is the platform by which Power Apps stores its data. So in the previous sessions where you've been looking at building a Power App, looking at building tables, looking at building the business intelligence and the business logic within those tables, all of that data sits within Dataverse. And essentially what we're doing here is taking data flow from an external source, and we are integrating that, building that actually onto Dataverse itself. Now, as I said before, we can do this as a bit of a one-off if we just needed to get some data into Dataverse as a starting point, so maybe some form of data migration or something like that. You can use a data flow to do that. So that's certainly one aspect. But the more typical use case is where you want to refresh that data. You want to keep it up to date with your source data that you maintain elsewhere. So you can develop and define refresh cycles on the back of that. I promised I wouldn't talk about Azure Data Lakes too much, but I'm going to again. So you can also integrate that data into basically the Gen 2, what's called the Gen 2 Azure Data Lake. That's for much wider integration and much wider work. It's not directly related to Power Apps, so not something I'm going to go into a lot of detail today. So let's talk about licenses very quickly. It's never a popular topic. I do appreciate that, but probably important we just touch on that. What do you actually need in terms of licensing to use data flows and to make some utilization of them? Well, probably the good news here is you don't need another Microsoft license. So thumbs up to that. Thank you, Microsoft, for that one. Principally, data flows are used to support the Power BI platform or on the Power Apps platform. So the two key licenses that tend to be used, either a Power BI Pro license, and indeed, if you're going to create Power BI reports, then you really need to have a Power BI Pro license in the first place, Or indeed, if you're creating a Power App, then or utilizing or using a Power App, then essentially you need to have a Power Apps license. So that's a per user license. Now, of course, it's Microsoft. So unfortunately, there are a couple of limitations around some of these licensing. And that's principally down to what are some of the capabilities that you can use based on that license, and also some of the volumes and the amount of data you can use. But to be honest, unless you're scaling into quite large corporate developments, you're probably not going to hit some of those limits. If you want to use some of the really funky things in there, so particularly things around some of the AI capabilities in Power BI, then you do need to have some of the other subscriptions. And those are things around the Power BI premium subscription, or the looking at some of the Azure stuff where you can get much larger storage. You need to look at things like a Gen 2 Azure Data Lake storage account. However, for the majority of things that I think you would generally be doing through Power Apps, Power App per user license or per app license generally covers what you need. So I guess one of the questions is, what are the benefits? So if we can go on to the next screen. There's a whole raft of kind of business and I guess as well technical benefits for using Dataflows. It's not just pure corporate benefits or not just technical benefits that you can get out of this. So I've listed a load here. I'm not going to talk about all of these in a lot of detail, but I guess one of the key things is the ability to actually control the data. So looking at this from really a corporate perspective, and we're talking about management of data, you can create reusable bits of data and logics and transformations that you apply to data, and you can use those in different places. So you can, for example, take your employee data, you could put some transformations on that, you could make that available from your core systems, and then you could share that with your developers to either create Power BI reports or to create further applications or to use that as reference data within those applications. But the key point is you're using that as a single source. Fully appreciate we've all been talking about single source of the truth and all that for many years, and the data continues to proliferate, and that gets harder and harder to do. But this is part of Microsoft's approach to actually try and enable corporations to get hold of their core data and to put some management around it. So one of the things that Dataflows can do is that can force the analysts to use Dataflows. It doesn't give you can stop people actually accessing that source underlying data in those systems and only give them the Dataflows to access. So again, going back to my example around employee data, maybe you just create one data flow for your employee data. You do all your transformation once, and then all your analysts would then reuse that data. So if something changed in the business logic, you would only have to change it once within that data flow, and you wouldn't need to go back to all these different reports or applications that different developers may have built over time and change it in all those different areas as well. So it's really enforcing through that business logic, and that really plays into its own where you've got quite complex transformations that you might need to do on your data. Particularly thinking around some calculations or some statistics or some definitions that you may need to define within your data. So as a really simple example, there may be a case of, well, how actually do you define a project? And some people define a project by its length or by the value of the particular project. And if you choose to change that and maybe categorize your projects as small, medium, and large based on their spend, if you decide to change those parameters, you would only need to do it once through a data flow, and that would automatically be reflected in all reports and all applications, which are then consuming that single workflow. Same kind of thing within KPIs. Again, if you were to find your KPIs centrally within a workflow, you only need to do it once. If you decided to change that KPI, again, you just change it once in that data flow, and then that's reflected through all your applications which are consuming it. Also, what you can do is provide more security around your data. So you've got more clarity over who's accessing that particular data by just giving them the data flow rather than giving it to end users. And probably quite a key thing is looking at performance as well. By enabling data flows, you are essentially accessing that data once. You are reducing the compute power that's needed. You are reducing the amount of times you need to go through and hit the end database to bring that data through. You can actually build them so they're much quicker to access that data as well. And you can build things like incremental refreshes in there as well, which again is reducing time and cost in terms of accessing that data and updating it. Probably a couple of things to say on this. In terms of the output, it is what we call product agnostic. So it's not a case where we are doing particular transformations or changes on the data, and then only certain applications can consume that data at the end. So if I take the example of kind of Click, which is a BI business intelligence tool. Click has a very specific format that it creates the data into, and only Click can then consume that data. If you're using Dataflows, you can do transformations in exactly the same way, but then you can share that with multiple different applications. Also, from a key element is the ability to run in the cloud. So there isn't actually any infrastructure that's required behind this. You don't need to stand up servers. It is fully compliant with the rest of the 365 platform as well. So you can build this very quickly. You don't need technical support behind it to manage your infrastructure. You can stand these things up, and also you can get rid of them very quickly if you feel you no longer require them. So hopefully that's outlined some of the benefits of why you would use Dataflows. Probably the next important thing then is to actually have a look at it and to give you a bit of a demo and show you what you can actually do. So if you bear with me a second, I'm just going to have to take control of the screen. So hopefully everybody can see my screen right now. Please, Rob, yell if you can't, but I assume that everybody can.
Yeah, all good from my side, Toby, so should be okay, mate.
Excellent. Okay, so to go to Dataflow, it's all web-based. So you go to your web browser of choice, which is, of course, Internet Explorer, and certainly not any other web browsers that aren't made by Microsoft. And there's various options, but you can come up to your waffle and go to your All Apps and go into Power Apps. Or indeed, you can just go up to your browser and you can type make.powerapps.com. And then that will log you onto your 365 tenant, and then you'll be able to go from there. So really what I want to do is take you through a kind of common, an example of how we can go and get some data through a Dataflow, link that in. I guess a great example might be we want to build a lessons learned application through Power Apps. Now, in our kind of scenario, it might be the case that lessons come from operations, they might come from our customers, but probably the majority of our lessons are going to come from our projects. And what we want to do is we want to be able to link these lessons which we're creating to the individual projects which are providing them. Now, I guess there's a number of ways we could do that. A really simple way is we could just allow people to, we could just build a lessons learned app, and we could allow people just to type in a project name or maybe to type in a project code. And that's fine. We've got a bit of information about the project. But what we haven't got is an actual link back to the data source relating to that project. So from a reporting perspective, we can't necessarily tie the two systems together. If somebody's typed in the wrong code, we've broken the relationship between our lessons learned log and our project master data. And as well as that, we can't really surface other data around the project. So maybe we'd want to go and find a project, and maybe we want to know a little bit details around it, maybe who the project manager was, maybe what the name of the project was, those kind of things, and just have that displayed alongside our lesson. So what we're going to do in this example is we're going to create a data flow. We're going to pull it through from our project system. And essentially then we're going to have a table created within our Dataverse. And that table will be populated from our project system. And we will then have the ability to control how often that data is updated and push that all the way through. And then I won't have time to show you today, but then we could build a lessons learned log and we could link the entity back to a particular project. So let's get started. I'm here on the front page. This is project for the web. This is a particular instance, just a test instance that I use, but this is where I'm going to get my data from. So I've got a number of test projects in here, and what I want to do is get the data relating to these test projects and make that available through Dataverse. So I'm coming back up to my Power Apps homepage, coming over to data, and you see down here there's a link called Dataflows. So I want to go and create myself a new data flow, and this is where I'm going to go. going to come up to the top, or a Dataflow, and there's a couple of options here. So I can start from a blank one, or indeed I can start from some form of template. And Rob was showing you some of the templates that are available to you. I'm going to start from absolute scratch here and just show you how this works. So I'm going to say start from scratch. First thing it's asking me for is what is the name of the Dataflow? What do I want to call it? So we're going to call it, of course, if I could spell my name, Toby Test Projects. Very inventive. Click create. So as that's starting to create, the next thing it's asking me is where do I want to go and get my data from? And you'll see what it's presenting at the moment. It's a whole raft of different connectors where I can go and get that underlying data. Okay, now again, these are all connectors to other data that sits on the cloud. You're not going to be able to connect directly into any systems or data sources that exist within your on-prem environments, but you can use things like gateways to enable that data to be visible. These are all in lots of different categories as well. So there's kind of file-based connectors such as Excel, or looking at XML documents. There's structured databases. There's Azure. There's all different categories in here. But the particular one I'm going to go for is something called No Data Feed. So this is something that Project Online uses to enable the data to be visible. So I'm going to click on that one. So it's now asking me for some information around my setting. So if I was connecting to an Excel spreadsheet, for example, it'd be saying, well, where is your Excel spreadsheet? Give me a link to it. Because there's no data feed, I need to give it some slightly different information. So I need to give it a URL and a few other bits of data on the side. So I'm just going to type that in now. And essentially then I'm going to create a new connection. So if there already was a pre-existing connection there, I could link to that, but I'm going to create a new one in this example. There isn't any form of gateway, so I don't need to worry about that. And then I need to say, well, what kind of security am I going to use to actually connect into this data source? So I'm going to go for organizational account, and then I need to go and actually connect to that data source as well. Just need to work through their steps, and that's now connected straight away. Because it's OData, it's asking me around my privacy levels. So this is really if I'm using different data sources, how do they all connect? So does it know which ones can be made available to different parts of the system? I'm just going to put that as organizational, which is always the safest thing to do. Okay, click next. So this is now going to load the transform. Isn't that always the way when you want to go and do a demonstration? Let's try that one more time. Fingers crossed this is going to work. Okay, so I'm just going to go back and we're going to give this one more attempt. Always the way when you want to do a demonstration, you can guarantee it's not going to work. Let's try edit connection, organizational account, sign in. Okay, so fingers crossed that is going to work, or we are going to have to do something slightly different. Oh dear, that doesn't sound very good, doesn't it? Isn't that always the way? Okay, so I'm going to show you something very similar, and it was always part of the demonstration I was going to show you today anyway, but essentially how you can achieve the same thing using tools which you've probably got already. So what this would have done is take me to the next stage, which is allowing me to do the transform element of that data. You can do exactly the same thing, essentially using exactly the same tools through Excel. And indeed, exactly the same tools are built into Power BI as well. So what I'm going to do, and fingers crossed I can actually connect this time, I'm going to go into some of my recent sources, and hopefully I should be able to connect to one of these as well. There we go. So if I was using Dataflows, I would have got virtually exactly the same screen. This is going to give me a list of all the data sources that exist within the particular data source that I connected to. So essentially all the tables or the entities that exist within that environment. And then I've got the option to select one or more of these. So I'm just going to select one in this instance, which is my project one. And what I do is I go through these. It gives me a little snapshot, so I can start to see some of the data and some of the fields that actually exist within this particular table. So I've got a couple of options: load or transform. If I was building a data flow, there's no load; it just takes you onto the transform. And at this stage, it then loads something called Power Query. Now, again, if I was using Dataflows, I would essentially get exactly the same interface. I get something called Power Query for the web. What I'm looking at here is essentially Power Query that is built into or part of Microsoft Excel. It is exactly the same tool that is built into the back of Power BI as well. So they are all using essentially Power Query as this ETL tool to connect to the underlying data source, to do the transformations, and then to do the load. So I just want to talk you through Power Query and what it can actually do, because this is really one of the most powerful tools that is out there. What you can do is pretty much any change or any movement on that particular data that you want. So if you wanted to filter the data, if you wanted to maybe add some additional data in there based on some logic in that data set, if you wanted to do some sorting, if you wanted to get rid of some of the columns, all these options are open to you. What you can also do is bring in multiple tables as well. So it's not necessarily limited to one table, and you can build some relationships and maybe bring in some data from those other tables as well. So if, for example, I wanted to know how many risks existed for each of my projects here, I could bring in my risk table, create a connection, and link those two things together. But let me take you through some very basic elements of this, and then I can explain to you how you can do this yourself. So the first thing you might be seeing is I've got an awful lot of columns out here because it's showing me all the fields that exist within that data source. And obviously, I don't want to bring all these things through. I'm only interested in seeing some of the key components that relate to projects. So what I want to do is actually reduce the number of columns. I want to choose which columns I can see, and I can click Choose Columns. Easiest thing to do here is just to say, actually, I want to unselect everything, and then bring through some of that key information that you want to have a look at. So in this case, I probably want to bring through my project ID because that's my unique identifier for each project. I want to bring through some descriptors. So I'm going to bring through the project name. I'm going to bring through the project owner name, which is essentially the project manager. And maybe I'm going to bring through the project template as well. And then maybe one other thing, let's just bring through a date, shall we, as well. So maybe the date the project was actually created. Let's bring through the finish date as well. So I've selected various items. I click OK. And then you see instantly all those other columns have then disappeared. So they no longer exist. They still exist in the data source. I haven't deleted anything, but they merely have now been removed from the transformation elements. What you also might note is over here on the right-hand side, and a step has been applied. And what Power Query will do is every time you work through and do something different on the data, it will add in another step. So it will record each of those pieces of items and work that you actually do on the system itself. So a couple of things I can do. Maybe I want to do a quick bit of sorting on here. And I can do this very simply. The interface is very similar to Excel. So I can choose to do some sorts within there. I can do some filtering as well. So you see here I've got a number of different templates. Maybe I'm only interested in the enterprise projects. So I can click on this and I can say, actually, I'm only interested in my enterprise projects. And again, it will filter that down. You see each time it's added an additional step within here as well. Maybe I want to do something a little bit more advanced. And in this case, maybe I want to put in, I want to understand which projects are deemed as an example project. So you see in the project name, some are called example. In fact, nearly they're all called examples, but one isn't. So what we can do is we can add an additional column. So this is new data we are essentially creating through this transformation element, and when we can push that and make that available through the data flow. In this case, we're going to push it out into Excel. Let's show you how that works. I can come up to add column. And then there's various options in here. So I can do it from an example. I can create custom columns. I can actually write functions, so some very detailed techie stuff that can go off and call other parts of data or do other things with the data. But I'm going to do a really simple one. I'm just going to enter in a conditional column. So I click new, I get this little interface that comes up. So we want to know, let's say, is example. So we want to know which one of these projects has basically got example in the name. So is example, which column are we interested in? We're interested in our project name. What's our operator? What it contains, and does it contain the word example? And if it does, we want to say yes, it's an example. And if it doesn't, then we're going to say no. And one thing just to note here, we're using Power Query. Power Query is case sensitive. So if I did a small e here, for example, it wouldn't like that at all. So I'm going to say OK. And you see, automatically I've added in another column over here with yes and no's, purely looking at that project name to identify whether or not it's got example as part of that project name. Other thing it's done down here is add in a conditional column as well. So if I wanted to come back to this, perhaps make some changes, I can click on the little cog at any stage and come in and change whatever I liked along here. So next thing to look at is perhaps the data types as well. So we've got an example over here, and at the moment that's just text. And I know that's text because I'm looking at this little thing at the top and it's telling me it's either an ABC or a 1, 2, 3. So it's not really determined what kind of data it is. But essentially it's a yes, no field. So we can click on that and we can do our data type, and actually we can set that to a true or false. And probably what I should have done back here is set this to something like a true, set that to a false down there. Okay, and then you'll see it's nice and happy that it's taking that essentially as a Boolean field, as a yes or a no. And we can do that with all our different fields. My project finish date here, for example, is currently set to a date and also a time. I'm not really interested in the time. I don't need to see that. So I'm just going to change that to a date. Okay, so I've kind of done enough to get myself a data set. I've done some transformations on that through Power Query, or would be using Power Query for the web if I was doing a Dataflow. A few other things to say on this. There, you can do an awful lot of very complex transformations on the data. There's a language called M that you actually use to do some of those transformations, and that is proper development stuff. But hopefully, as you've seen here, I can come in as a very simple base user, connect some data, do some very simple transformations, and get a clean data set out the back of it. What you can also do is build in a language called R, which is a statistical language, if you want to do some extra statistical analysis. And you could even build in some kind of AI into this as well. So there are links to there's API, there's AI elements within Azure, and you can do things like sentiment analysis, looking at comments to see whether they're positive or negative, and that returns basically a value between 0 and 1. And that will show you, look based on some comments that might be coming in from customers, how good or bad they are, purely using that AI engine to generate that through. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click close and load. And I was talking about the ETL element. So this is really the L element. And this enables me to essentially load that data back into Excel. Now, ideally, if we were using Dataflows, which unfortunately don't seem to be working very well. But if I was using a Dataflow on here, and I personally didn't build any earlier because I tested it and it worked fine. But I would then be presented with a couple of options over what I wanted to do. I've created my data. I've essentially got it ready to be loaded. But Power Apps would then ask me a couple of questions. So it would then say, well, what do you want to do with this data? Do you want to load this to a brand new table, essentially, or do I want to load it to an existing table? And if I was going to load it to a brand new table, it basically ask me some key questions over what I want to call it, what is some of the, who's the owner of that data, that kind of thing, and I could click go. And it would go in the background and it would generate that table and load that data through. If I chose I wanted to load it to a existing table, it would allow me to do some mapping. So it would say, well, which field relates to which, and I would have to map that all the way through. And again, I could click go, and it would take that data and load that through. And then I would be able to come back to this data flow section, and I will try and build one in a second in the background. But within this section, it would then give me some options over, well, how often do I want to run this data flow? Essentially, how often do I want to refresh my data? And I can set that up to go automatically, provide some credentials behind it. And I can say, well, refresh it every hour, every day, every week, whatever I wanted to do. And then that data flow would essentially run and repopulate those tables on a regular basis. So I apologize for not actually being able to build one on the fly. What I was going to do is just maybe come off screen for a minute and just see if I can just try and rebuild one very quickly and really give the floor over to Rob for 5 minutes just to take any questions and to talk about some other elements of iCoTech, if that's okay with you, Rob.
Yeah, absolutely, Toby. Apologies. I had to unmute my mic as well as pull the little tab down, which is, I'm sure, is a problem that a few people have probably had on this call. So yeah, thank you ever so much for your demo there, Toby. I think that was great, and it's really frustrating, unfortunately, when things don't work out in the demo world. But that's the gamble that we take, and especially doing this format as well. It's all very new to us. So just while Toby's working away on that very quickly, I'd love to ask initially if there's any questions about what's been shown there. If you could take this opportunity to just type them up into the chat window and get them fired through so that we've got an opportunity to kind of read them, digest them, and put together a response and answer those questions for you. So I'd like to take the opportunity to kind of encourage people to do that. We thrive on feedback and interaction on these sessions, despite how it may be on this one with the one-way nature of the call. But outside of that as well, while Toby's just working on those other bits, I just really like to take the opportunity to obviously thank you for coming along to today's session and coming with us on the journey through the kind of the Power Ups workshops. And I can see a number of people that have joined us on various other sessions that we've hosted in completely other technology stacks and completely different kind of areas, I guess, of the business. So as you know, we do an event every week here at iCoTech. We share something. We always, we're really passionate about producing content and sharing that out with our audience and our community. So just very quickly to let you know, depending on where you work and what your interests are, some of the stuff that we've got coming up is really exciting. We've got some things around Microsoft Planner. We've got some Power Platform stuff. Obviously, this series of workshop will continue. I don't think we're at the end of the journey just yet with these ones, and we're also doing some really cool stuff with regards to Microsoft Teams and some of the updates and new functionality, which some of you may be experiencing for the first time here with this sort of one-way presentation style of delivering things. But yeah, if any of those topics are of interest to you, please, rush over and have a look at our LinkedIn is where we seem to get most of our content in its easiest to consume form. But obviously we have the YouTube channel as well. We have Twitter, Facebook, every social media that we can try and get in front of. We're making more of a conscious effort to make sure that more people can go and find this in their platform of choice and go and consume it. So if you want to see what those webinars are coming up, have a look at our social feed, or alternatively, ping myself, Toby, Lauren a message, and we'd be happy to share with you the content that's coming up, and also just let you know what the future webinars are. And then the final piece from me, depending on how Toby's getting on, is very much yep, good, cool. I'll start wrapping up for you then, Toby. The final one from me, really, guys, is again, massive thank you for joining us. We're doing lots of different stuff in different spaces, but we'll be sending out a survey at the back of this webinar just to get your thoughts, feedback, comments, questions, because these sessions really have been born from a need from our community to demonstrate a particular problem or a particular use case or a particular business challenge. So if it's something that maybe you don't feel comfortable asking a question in the chat, please don't feel shy of reaching out to us and saying, I've got this problem, can you maybe do a session on it in the future? Or actually, here's a topic within the Microsoft arena that we really want to know more about and do more. As great as it is for us to put together kind of the content schedules, we're very open to being led by our community, which is obviously you guys, in terms of what you want to see and where you want us to focus. So yeah, pop a comment in the chat, send it to us in an email afterwards, put it up on our LinkedIn. Not really particularly fussy how we get that feedback. It's just really important to us that we stay relevant to what you guys want to see and what you want. But with that being said, I'll pass back over to Toby now, because I think he's got a couple final bits to show you. But thank you for joining us so far, guys.
Thank you, Rob. Okay, so yeah, apologies for that earlier. What I've now done is I've that Excel table that I just created and showed you a minute ago, I've actually linked to that Excel table just to show you what that looks like. Essentially, if you're looking at this interface, hopefully you'll see it's very similar to what I was just showing you in Excel. This has already done the transformations because I'm picking up that Excel data, but essentially everything that I just showed you a second ago in terms of what you can do in terms of hiding columns, filtering columns, adding in some new stuff, you can do here as well. In fact, you can even do a couple of extra things within the Power Query for the web, but primarily the same thing. So what we're now going to do is complete this data flow. So I'm just going to click next. And as I was describing, it's giving you a couple of options. Now, I've never quite understood why you would not bother loading a table in the first place if you're creating a data flow, but I'm sure there is a use case for that. But essentially, there's two options here. You load a new table, or you can load to an existing table. So we're going to create a new table. So Toby test projects, ingenious as ever. We've got then a couple of other options. So we can give it a description. It automatically creates a data type, but it gives you a little bit of flexibility. So you can have a text or multi-line text. So there's a couple of extra options you can put in there. I'm going to skip over these fairly quickly. Click next. What that will then do is start to generate my data flow. A couple of options. Do I want to refresh manually? Do I want to refresh automatically? So this is where you can define that frequency. You can obviously go back and change that at a later stage as well. And then you click save. That will essentially save that data flow as a particular item sat within your data flows on Power Apps. You can there see it's being created. So I think that's an error from earlier. But what that will then do is that will start to when we run it, and I don't think we're going to have time to run it in time, but I would be able to go into my tables. And within my tables, I would then see a new table that's been created. So maybe if I just look at my custom tables, I would then be able to scroll down and there will be, and it takes around about 5 minutes to actually run the first time, but there will be a new table in there called Toby test projects. That will hold all the data that's within that Excel spreadsheet. I would also be able to go into that table and treat it as any normal Power Apps table. So we'll be able to go in there, build in some business logic, build in some rules. And then from a Power Apps perspective, I would be able to, going back to my scenario, I would be able to build a lessons learned log. And I would be able to link that particular table, holding that data, which is then linked to my source data of projects, and be able to reference that through. So again, apologies for that not working quite as planned. As for any great demonstration, technology always gets in the way. But hopefully that's given you a feel for what you can do with data flows, how they can apply some logic, and how you can actually go about using them yourself.
Thank you ever so much for the comments, guys. It doesn't look like we've got questions coming through, so we'll end the session there. But if anything does come across, please don't hesitate to email us, info@icotechservices.co.uk, and we'll be sure to get back to you. And if you want to borrow, I would offer myself, but I'd be no use to you. But maybe someone like Toby, if you want to pick their brains for 20 minutes, I'm sure we can organize something for you just to answer some questions and give you an insight and some steer. But other than that, thank you ever so much for attending, guys, and we look forward to hopefully seeing you all on the next session. Take care, all the best, stay safe.